Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is still locked in a pandemic. It's hard for some of us to imagine that in privileged areas or privileged generations like mine have been quadruple vaccinated, including the boosters. There are still a couple billion people on the planet who have not had a single shot. Variants will keep percolating, and that means we're going to keep having problems. And there's more pathogens coming down the pike. It's an overheating planet, thanks to greenhouse emissions that are built in the atmosphere through the past century, especially the past few decades. And I've been writing about this since the 1980s. So it's become kind of a frustrating reality that we're not really grasping this problem yet. And generations have come along, like those you're going to meet tonight, who are working really hard to grapple with the profundity of this moment on Earth when humans have gone from polluting a particular pond or a lake to changing the entire Earth system in a profound way that will have thousands of years of repercussions ecologically, climatologically. We have a great discussion lined up tonight through the Columbia Climate School with the author of a new book, Generation Dread, Britt Wray. You will hear from her in a couple of minutes. I'll tell you more about her background and her work. And one graduate of Columbia's Sustainable Development Program, undergraduate, just got out, Sophia Assab, and Devin Tetchin, who's at Cooper Union and is, I think, graduating next year, if I've got this right. And they had launched this. So the book is called Generation Dread. And I'll show you Finding Purpose in an Age of Climate Crisis. And these young people had, partially through this forum I've created with the Sustain What, have launched a series called Generation Mad. I grew up in the 60s, 70s, 80s with Generation Mad being about nuclear destruction, mutually assured destruction, mad. And they have a different definition of that. So if you guys could unmute, we can kind of greet you and get into this. I'm going to try to leave as much of the discussion as possible to the young people here, of which I'm no longer one. I'm young at heart, but that's the only part of me that really is young. So first of all, greetings to you, Britt. Thanks for taking your time to do this conversation. I know you have a very busy schedule. I think you're on the radio shortly after, or you're recording another event, and many other things going on with the book.
Well, it's my total pleasure, Andy. Thank you. And I've been following your work from afar for a long time, so it's really nice to be here.
And I should tell the audience, if I freeze, they're going to keep talking because I'm on Elon Musk's Starlink system. I've just moved to rural coastal Maine, and my connection to the internet is up there. It's not through a wire. And there's a couple thousand satellites, but we have too many trees around us, so we don't have a perfect connection. I apologize for that. So Devin and Sophia, first of all, Sophia, congratulations on graduation.
Thank you. Feels good. Freeing.
Yeah. And could you just say a little bit about your final project?
Yeah,
it's highly relevant.
Yeah, I ended up doing, so I just, as Andy said, graduated from the Sustainable Development Program at Columbia, which is very interdisciplinary. You can kind of, there's an environmental science program, and then there's sustainable development, and sustainable development takes on the more kind of social aspect of the climate crisis. And I really resonated with that because I've always been interested in the social side and the psychological side, stemming from my interest in well-being and sustainability. And one of the reasons I'm very excited to talk to Britt. But my final research ended up being a lot about the value action gaps within sustainability, and I'm going to continue that research because it needs continuing. But kind of first observations were that a lot of people are saying that they want to do things, they want to make change, and then when you look at the actions of those same people, it falls short. And I think all of us listening can kind of resonate with that. I know myself, I have a lot of really strong beliefs about how I want to be in the world, and sometimes I don't necessarily act on them. And I think the value action gap thing is one of the main issues we need to tackle before anything's going to really get done, because we can be all rah and go walk in the streets, which is amazing, but we have to actually act on those beliefs.
And Devin, you're focused on design, I believe. I can't remember if it's at the urban scale or architecture and urban design.
Yeah, architecturally, I was really interested in kind of how cities organize. Like one of the ideas I had for my thesis when I was really looking into it was to kind of take New York City and see, okay, what happens if you remove as many cars as possible? Ways of doing that, ways of kind of restructuring our society, and then what do you do with that new space? Because we've created all of these cities and all these urban areas around the car. Even before the car, we've augmented them to fit the car.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we meet that afterwards? Where now more recently, post an architectural perspective, I've also been looking at technology and like how the technology landscape and the companies that exist, the products that exist, and the economy that we have, and how that really incentivizes certain behaviors that we don't necessarily want to condone for the climate. And for our own ecological footprint and for the people and the other species on this planet. So I think it's really interesting to take those two things, which is one is very design, like you said, urban planning and kind of like organizational, and the other one is very active. It's like what we do on a day-to-day basis, like purchasing products through Amazon, the supply chain, the infrastructure, and also like why do we need to consume so much, the philosophical and also like emotional, psychological impacts on that. So I think it's really interesting, and that's why Sophia and I have connected over this, because we have very similar viewpoints from very different perspectives. So that's why we did Generation Mad, and why we're lucky enough to speak to Britt about her new book today.
That's so awesome, Britt. We're going to get to the book in a second, but I just wanted to make sure people understand you're not quote unquote just a writer. You're not just a public figure. You're deep into research. I went to Google Scholar, and you're now currently you have a joint position in planetary health. Can you just say what it is at Stanford and in England, I think, right?
Yeah, at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So thank you. I'm doing my postdoc right now between the two universities under the banner of Planetary Health. So this is an interdisciplinary field that really tries to quantify and qualify the costs to human health that anthropogenic change on the planet is causing right now across more than just the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, land transformation, air pollution, many other effects that that we're having because of our behavioral impacts. And instead of advocating for change because, for example, we should care about polar bears, we should care about human health and human survival and vector-borne diseases and chronic disease and mental health issues and so on and so forth. So really, it's an articulation of the reasons why, out of self-interest, humans ought to get on the sustainability bandwagon, because other forms of campaigning haven't been doing such a hot job over many decades.
That's so true. That in that issue, that business of self-interest and basic moral principles comes up over and over again in both how we treat the pandemic. I did a bunch of sessions on here on vaccine gaps in the world. And, anyone in the rich world who thinks, oh, that's a poor world problem, is missing the practical reality that if we don't deal with the system, we're just going to keep having more of this. So now let's get to this book. One of the simplest questions is, why did you write about Generation Dread?
Sure. So I think of the book as a tour guide, really, through the evolving landscape of eco-distress, which we know is rising out there in society, but is not necessarily a new concept. Many groups have been feeling traumatic emotional repercussions from a changing Earth for a long time. Over 500 years of colonization, indigenous peoples have had their relationships to the land, to species they consider kin, interrupted by violent upheaval with settler colonialism. And what we're seeing now, many post-colonial and anti-colonial and indigenous scholars will tell us, is basically a deja vu, where the kind of emotional heaviness, the grief and the anxiety and the fear that indigenous communities have had to live with amidst unwanted environmental change is now something that all people are experiencing on a changing Earth because of anthropogenic activity, extraction, industrialism, and so on. And there's a real jolt of panic and fear and hopelessness and dread, different amalgamations of challenging feelings that come with confronting the climate crisis, experiencing climate disasters, understanding that it's not climate in isolation, but a polycrisis of intersecting planetary threats, which more people are waking up to. So I had my own waking up to this in a really profound way several years ago, even though I'd already done a degree in conservation biology and cared a lot and had felt emotional about species extinction, so to speak. But it became profoundly intimate, and new forms of existential feelings arose in my life when I was at this crossroads of contemplating with my partner whether or not we wanted to try and get pregnant. And given my work as a science communicator, ingesting all the grim reports and then squaring that with the lack of effective action, it gave me pause. I no longer just rushed into this decision that I'd long wanted to do. I really questioned deeply whether it was wise and compassionate to go about bringing another person into the world to deal with climate disruption over their lifetime. And that was my on-ramp to eco-anxiety and grief, which was really new for me. The American Psychological Association defines eco-anxiety as the chronic fear of environmental doom. And that risks pathologizing it and saying that it's some kind of mental disorder, when mental health professionals largely agree that it's actually a very healthy and normal response to feel distressed about what's going on, because it shows that you're connected and compassionate and you can comprehend what we're going through and what we're moving towards because of the costs of historical and current inaction. But of course, it's not a healthy thing if it becomes overwhelming, debilitating, impairs one's functioning, traps someone in a pit of despair, or makes them commit to an idea of hopelessness when there is so much power that those of us who are alive today have over how bad it's going to get, how depleted environments will become, how warm temperatures will rise, etc. And so this is a really complex matrix of emotions to try and navigate. I wanted resources when I was going through my bout of eco-distress in a pretty acute way, and I couldn't find them. And I didn't see anything on this particular on-ramp through the reproductive anxiety piece I was experiencing that was critically analyzing it. I felt like my privilege was perhaps coming in to twist this as a white middle-class Canadian woman who hadn't experienced existential threats before and had a new set of emotions. I really wanted to check that in a scrutinizing way. And one thing led to the other, and I ended up doing research that went into this book to validate eco-distress, surface what the research field is telling us about how it shows up in people's lives, how we can move through it, and ultimately what good it is for, both for climate justice and for maintaining a robust sense of hope and action and collective solidarity as we move through these turbulent times, rather than committing to the kinds of fatalistic narratives that are also rising out there, as many people are quickly it feels like going from a space of denial to doomerism and skipping out on that work in between when we need to be courageous and creative and sit in that tense gray zone that doesn't give into black and white thinking about it all being naive hope or it all being doom and gloom. So long story short, it was about trying to tackle those forms of questions and then come to the other side.
Andy, I think you're muted.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say over to you, Devin and Sophia, because I have lots more questions, but I don't want to be the privileged one here. So to you guys.
One thing that is so interesting to me in all of that is what you said about how it is healthy to feel that way, and how it's interesting. I'm currently working in ESG consulting, so I'm working with a lot of big companies on creating more sustainable platforms and protocols for their company. And I don't see a lot of dread. I see a lot of whatever, let's just do this. It's good for business, lowers risk. And with the people who I talk to who are involved, and I met at Columbia and Santa Barbara, who are kind of seeing the things and researching the things, they are the ones with dread and fear. And they're also potentially the ones who are more connected to themselves and going after their own happiness. And I think, again, what you said about it being healthy, it makes me think of what I'm really interested in which is that I think that people need to be in an okay place to confront this. And like, maybe I'm in an okay place and I'm taking care of my happiness, and then I start to realize the dread and I experience it. But I think if people are, which I think a lot of people, especially in the United States, are depressed and checked out and anxious from the world we live in, they can't even, I think for me, what I'm seeing is that's why it goes from like the kind of, I don't know what's going on, to the complete despair and missing out on the action. Because when you're not well mentally, how can you do that? How can you have the energy to act? So I just find that super interesting, and it resonates with my very specific interest of happiness and sustainability.
Yeah, those are some really interesting observations. We do know from the research that's evolving now on eco-anxiety, and you'll notice I kind of switch between eco-distress and eco-anxiety, but umbrella terms for these challenging emotions, is that there are a few populations that it is really pronounced in. One, unsurprisingly, being young people, those who grow up aware of this crisis and the unjust situation of having inherited the duty to clean it up without having created it. And there's profound sense of moral injury of being caught up in the system in which adults are not carrying their weight and have kind of checked out or left the building, and the kind of institutional betrayal of being belittled and by leaders and kind of lied to essentially about how bad this is becoming. So there's also research to show us that frontline communities, unsurprisingly, feel this intensity more from knowing that there's disproportionate vulnerability they're already dealing with. And these are predominantly poor communities of color that had the least to do with creating this crisis in regions all over the world. We did one study of 10,000 16 to 25-year-olds in 10 countries around the world to understand their scope and burden of climate anxiety. And we found that 45% of those 10,000 young people, and this is across India, Nigeria, Philippines, Brazil, France, UK, US, Finland, some others, 45% said that their feelings about the climate crisis are negatively impacting their functioning. So their ability to eat or sleep or concentrate, go to school, go to work, play, have fun. So really quite impairing at high level. 75% saying that they feel the future is frightening, 56% saying that they feel humanity is doomed. And this was more pronounced in places like Nigeria and India and the Philippines than it was in a place like the United States. And also here in the US, the Yale program on climate communication has data to show that Black and Latino communities are more alarmed than their white counterparts, but also more willing to move into agency on the matter and take up action roles, which is interesting about the constructive parts of this distress. It's really complex. You can both have high distress, but high action, right? So it's not always this paralyzing and immobilizing fear that people can kind of knee-jerk reaction write it off as. It can really be a super fuel if channeled and harnessed. So what you're noticing there too is that the researchers who are really doing the front work as scientists collecting the data are more distressed than the people in ESG thinking about bottom line business outcomes. And that's the third vulnerable group that we see from the research too, that, the climate scientists and the conservation biologists and the climate journalists and those who really think about this crisis 8+ hours a day do bear a psychological cost that comes with witnessing the decline of ecosystems that they love and knowing that there's solutions that aren't being deployed, which is super frustrating, and there's burnout and mental exhaustion. And people who work in this space will not be surprised by this, even if they've found really high functioning ways of keeping that burnout at bay. So it's really complex. We're still trying to figure out profiles of which personalities get more provoked to the extreme ends of climate distress, who's able to deal with it more constructively. How does this intersect with pre-existing mental health problems? We know you don't need a pre-existing anxiety disorder to feel it, but what happens if you do have one, or OCD or something of that nature, which can cause rumination? So it's really early days for the research on this, but aside from just affecting thoughts and feelings, we also know it can have a profound impact on people's future planning. So not just the having babies piece that I already alluded to, but which jobs to work in, where people think about moving, spending their life, what kind of climate secure places to seek out if they have privilege to do that, what they think about saving money or saving for the future, and these kinds of things that really get at the existential feelings some people are carrying around with them.
I want to interject one question, one thought, and this came through a reader of my column, my Sustain What column, who sent in this question. Here, I'll put it on the screen. Let's see if this works. She asked, and this gets to what you were just saying, Britt, about the lack of clarity yet in the research. Why do some climate scientists seem optimistic about our future in terms of climate change and feel that our children and us aren't doomed, and others are crying and gluing and chaining themselves to things? How do we know who is right or who to believe? As a parent, I'm very scared for what we face, and I'm terrified that not enough is being done by those in power. Really interesting reflection.
Yeah,
What would you say?
I have the same question. I love this question. And I often consider this one because it's true. It can feel a bit like whiplash, depending on which scientific authority you're paying attention to. And there's this extra technical challenge for those of us who are not climate scientists, is that we really have to trust the climate scientists. We don't have their analytical tools for interpreting the data. And so what they say has heightened validity and importance in the public sphere when coming from, well-educated, highly experienced peer-review publishing climate scientists. And we do see this split across who's saying what, which can be tricky. And we don't know exactly why this is and why certain people take a very different tone to their tactics for energizing the public and expressions of comfort around disclosure of their distress, right? But we know that we're in a landscape of seeing very radical kind of Extinction Rebellion aligned scientists at big institutions, and those who say that they are blaming the media and its alarmist storytelling for young people's climate anxiety rather than the actual scientific data itself. My take is that even just following the IPCC, which has to be signed on by so many people and is relatively conservative compared to what other statements would we ingest from climate scientists say, is itself alarming enough to be able to follow and make your own interpretations from. And while I have kind of suffered from just trying to follow and make up my own mind across these different forms, it ultimately, it's okay to, I think, meditate on the fact that we are not in control and we are not able to decipher all of the messages through a single lane. And we have to be critical consumers of this, as well as imperfectly analytical about who it's coming from and what their tactics are. What do you think, Andy? I'm curious.
And, to get your reactions to this too, you must have friends who are across the spectrum of worry, belief, and strategy. Do people get into sort of debates about who's right and wrong?
Was that to us or Britt?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
And then we want to hear your thoughts, just so you know. After that, what do you think? Have you? I mean, I was in classrooms with people who were devoting their undergrad education to kind of this question, and I honestly feel like people just kind of stopped reading anything. Like, that's just what I have experienced. I think people are just in the, I guess, older echelon of Gen Z, the recent college grads, are a lot of them, myself included, are just like, I'm just going to do what I can and I can't listen to anything else. Like, I know there is an issue, but Devin and I are very different in this, so I may let him talk for a second, but I personally will just focus on my personal research and do everything I can as an individual to not be a high carbon individual and understand my insane privilege of living in the United States. And I know I don't want to consume over one Earth, if you guys have taken that footprint test. But yeah, I don't read, and a lot of my friends don't read anything because it's just too conflicting. He does. So
yeah, I'm fully absorbed in the literature, in YouTube videos that come out on a weekly basis, just full doom and gloom. And I'm not a doomer, but I take in all the same content that a doomer would take in. And for people who don't know, a doomer is someone who just thinks that everything sucks and the world's going to end and there's no way to change it. Pretty much, like, we're doomed to a climate catastrophe. But for me, it's a weird balance between understanding everything, seeing how bad the problem is, and also kind of having optimism for change. Because even before I was aware of climate change, I was aware of capitalism and the society we live in and the problems associated with capitalism that kind of are almost correlated in a very weird way with our climate issues as well, and our ecological footprint, and our consumption drives all these other problems. Anyway, so because of that, I kind of had this balancing act of, I live in a capitalist society, I want to make change, but how do you reckon with those two things of existing in a system that you don't even want to be within and want to change? So, for example, eating meat, right? Like, we live in a system where just one person not eating meat doesn't really make a big change. You want systemic change of everybody going plant-based, or at least a huge swath of people cutting out red meat and things like that. But that takes action by a huge amount of people. And this brings me to what you were saying before too, which makes me think about this in a certain way, which is, it's almost like if climate change was a runaway train, it was either stopped or it's going at full speed. It almost skipped a whole way of acceleration where either people were totally unaware of it generally in the general zeitgeist, or they were extremely aware of it, and now it's almost like at a point of disaster and there's nothing you could do about it. And I feel like our generation is that level, and everyone younger than us too, because I'm 24. Like, I'm pretty old in this fight at this level. Like, there's so many kids who are growing up with all of this anxiety, and I can only imagine what their kids are going to feel. So I feel like until, for example, like the average age of someone who's aware of climate change passes the median, I don't really think it's going to be that big of a deal. Like, there's not going to be politicians who really care until we have Alexandria Ocasio or Cortez at like 60 years old, like things like that. So
I just need to clarify, because I saw a comment came in about that people aren't reading, and I want to clarify that we are all reading. We are, but we're not watching the news and like Googling the
it's academic.
It's academic reading. And this is again within my circle at Columbia, who I talk with, so I'm not speaking for everyone.
You don't obsess with it.
Yeah, as someone who deeply wants to make positive change, I cannot go and kind of read the summaries and like in the news. But academic reading is different.
So Andy, what do you think? Because you've been here covering this since the 80s, like you said.
Yeah. Well, it's so refreshing to see scholars and scientists like Britt get into this arena, and others, Renee Lertzman, who I first interviewed back in 2010, looking at psychiatry and climate. I spent, like, from 1988 until 2006, virtually every story I wrote was about the biogeophysical phenomenon around climate. CO2 heating the atmosphere, changing the oceans, blah, blah, blah. And it was 2006 was the first time I interviewed a social scientist, literally. So 18 years into this beat, I was stuck on it, as was the IPCC, by the way, as being a physical, phenomenon. And the social climate, the more I've dug in, is by far the more critical arena here. And and then you look at that. Indra Overland and Sovakul did a paper in January looking at relative budgets for research on climate solutions going into tech and physics. and going into behavioral science, and the behavioral science is like this tiny, tiny sliver.
Yeah.
So the thing that's largely shaping what we do or don't do is not even, as Britt was saying, you look at Google Scholar, there's lots of work, but there's still not a lot of understanding. Things that I love, like the red and blue, the warming stripes, which actually I showed at the beginning of the show in the background of that illustration. It's all over. It got on the cover of The Economist. I talked to Sabine Paul, who's a psychologist at Plymouth University, and Ulrich Kahn, who's a PhD student looking at art and climate. And no one has a freaking clue if it is changing behavior. And we need to. So this is it's super important. The book, for that reason alone, to just draw attention to the dynamics that are in play. And the lack of understanding is really important to me. One thing that I think is a frontier also, and this relates to friends of mine like Jacqueline Gill here in Maine, 40 miles from me at University of Maine, who's been pummeled relentlessly on social media for not being a doomist. How dare you not be a doomist?
She gets a lot of abuse.
And she's not alone, and it's
exactly.
She actually has been on a session on here on how to survive abuse online with the Pen America. What I think could benefit the world generally is more tolerance of the reality that it's normal for humans to have a variety of responses to a stress. And there is this work in ecosystems. I'll show a slide here because why not? Let me see. Remove. I'm going to show this because it's worth seeing. Stop share. Well, anyway, in 2003, Thomas Elmqvist, Stockholm Resilience Institute, led a study of what's called response diversity in ecosystems. And what they found was that the diversity of responses in a species to an environmental stress is a better indicator of the adaptive capacity of the ecosystem than the diversity of species. So diversity of responses to environmental stress is what you want. Imagine if we were all Bill Gatesy, or all, what Greta has done is great, but if we were all Greta, would the world function well? We need all of humanity, and that means the range of humanity. And that means accepting someone's doom or someone's optimism. That feels to me, and I think that comes through in parts of your book too. So Britt, I don't know what you think about that generally. Is that simply a research frontier, or is there some, already some clarity that it's normal to be different?
What you said is just so well put, and it's extremely true. It is at the margins of our knowledge through a research perspective. There has not yet been a latent profile analysis about how people respond to, the psychological impacts of the climate crisis, though it would be very interesting to do. Yeah, of course. And that's fantastic to see from that ecosystem perspective. Diversity of stress response is more important than biodiversity itself. And think about us. What we're going through is a massive restoring of our species, as at different moments, different groups of us wake up to the severity of what we're dealing with. And some have a process, as I talk about in the book, it becomes a bit like an internal shattering that rearranges everything about their self-concept and world concept. The thing is, the climate crisis makes many people think of death, not only because of acute climate disasters, but also the death of global structures. We understand that they must change in radical ways if we are going to regenerate the earth and secure a nice future for ourselves, right? So there is a kind of letting go in order to build something in its place, which is also threatening to people as they are committed to livelihoods and aspects of their identity that are caught up in a fossil fuel architecture, let's say.
Oh boy.
Or certain comforts that come from it. Yes?
There was a paper by Robert Bruhl and Carrie Norgard on what they call social inertia that is right on this point. It's that once you realize those structural realities, the momentousness, the hyper-object quality, as some would call it, that leads to a diminishment of your effort, that you end up kind of pulling back to flying less, or you. It's a really interesting long paper about this concept of mass and complexity, and those institutional barriers to change being so. It's not just paralytic, but it kind of causes a kind of retrenchment that seems really problematic.
Yes. Yeah. Very foreboding. And some people do experience this in different ways than others, where they're going to have to do a lot of internal processing and work to be able to come out the other side of a U-shaped curve and find some stubborn optimism. If that is the place where they end up, which could be good for their sense of not narratively foreclosing the future and increasing their well-being and ability to celebrate the other simultaneous truths about the world and being alive, and, you know, putting joy at the center of their experience, even while being able to comprehend and face scary truths. Other people might have had lots of experience with existential threats, and so it's not all that shattering to contemplate that the world isn't a safe place. Right. And everything in between. And I think that these kinds of punctuations in our experience as humans on this planet really do shape then what our stress response is to the climate and wider ecological crisis, and can mean that maybe we have more of the tearful response in a public way for a climate scientist, or we, provide a more hopeful approach to dealing with difficulty, and, as the scholar Donna Haraway would say, staying with the trouble of what's going on. So anyway, very curious. Don't have the data on what pushes us in one direction or another, but those are some cultural contemplations about the politics of what these emotions do and how they come to show up in our lives at all in different ways. Yeah, forget what else that I was going to add.
No, that's a very rich stew right there. And again, I hope people check out Generation Dread, the book, and you have a your Substack is called
Gendread.substack.com.
Say it again.
Gendread.substack.com.
Gendread.substack.com. Again, back to Sophia and Devin. So I gave you a little bit of what I'm thinking. The point about mortality, I'll just build on a little bit, because almost 2 years ago, in the early days of the pandemic, Katie Kish, a postdoc at McGill, saw a session I did with Kate Rayworth and Herman Daly, and she pitched me the idea of doing one on something I had never heard about, but which now I've dug in on, terror management theory.
Yes.
The work of, it goes back to Weber, but and others, but Sheldon Solomon at Skidmore came on the show with Simon Dalby and had a really interesting discussion of mortality awareness, this particularly human trait, and how that shapes our reaction to stress also, which is kind of the opposite of what I was talking about earlier. It tends to make us, at least that work explained the rise of Hitler and the rise of Trump. It's like mortality awareness. And Sheldon Solomon did this experimental work showing if you like flicker a slide at folks that sort of reminds them they're going to die, and then a half hour later you're talking about something else, that they tend to kind of go in a certain direction. And that's pretty profound too. There's plenty of hope and stuff too, but this shows you there's really big phenomena at work here.
And just to briefly go off that, there's this peer support network called the Good Grief Network for moving people through eco-anxiety and grief towards ways of reinvesting in actions that matter and that are purposeful, rather than just simply being so stressed out, using that restless energy for something that is mutually helpful. And I did that program in order to write about it in the book. And I learned about terror management theory through their step, which was about confronting mortality. And I found it so poignant about how, really articulating that we are these deeply disquieted animals that will do almost anything to avoid being reminded of the fact that we're going to die unconsciously in ways that we are not in control of, which explains, as you say, why we end up creating more evil, even as we believe that we're protecting ourselves against it. And a lot of our struggles come down to a fight over cultural symbolism, the only things that can really transcend our fleeting time on Earth as mere mortals. And The interesting thing I think about confronting mortality in the climate crisis, though, not that it means that you have to start thinking that you're going to die of the climate crisis in any kind of direct way. It's more so that you can really tap into that paradoxical, strange, uncanny thing that happens when you contemplate being on your deathbed and you get to look at how you spent your time and ask questions about, am I glad that I used all of those days to chase money over purpose, or, spent the late nights at the office as opposed to working on that environmental bill, or, with the community group, or with my kids, or making art, or the things that bring you joy. And so it can really unleash a bold aliveness and really help us within the discontents of this tattered world, really be our best, most vibrant selves when we can think in a conscious way about death rather than consistently just try to paper over it and avoid it. And a lot of, I think, what you're talking about with your work there, Sophia, the value action gaps in sustainability, a lot of what climate psychology would show us is that although it can feel like we're walking around in a sea of apathetic humans who don't care about the climate crisis because no one's, when we're just going about our day, it doesn't seem as though they're working on the problem as society goes on in its carbon intensive ways. Really, it's not that people don't care. It's that confronting this crisis raises anxiety and death anxiety, and also ambivalence about the role that we're playing in upholding these systems, which are intolerable feelings in themselves. And so we just kind of tamper it down, stick our head in the sand, and do what we can to perversely avoid confronting reality, because we've always gotten by with a dash of wishful thinking when the world is tough to bear. But in this scenario, it's really threatening to us. So there's something really healthy about being able to bring about tactics for thinking about death, thinking about anxiety, thinking about the things that scare us, giving it permission, and then it can kind of lose its power over you, ideally, and stop thwarting the action so that we don't have these huge value action gaps.
Yeah. And one thing that is so amazing about I completely agree with everything you said. And also, Andy, kind of maybe answering your question a long time ago about my specific generation, what I'm seeing. And I can maybe tell a little story of why I even did sustainable development, which is that I took a class in high school called Global Futures, Global Warming. And when I was in high school, I wanted to do human rights work and potentially major in creative writing. And then I took this class and I got that sense of dread. I looked around, and I was at a fancy prep school in New England, and I was like, I'm probably surrounded by a lot of future bankers. And how on earth is that the case when we are learning about this crazy disparity and inequality? And we read this book called, I think, 2052, which was like a prediction book about the future. And I was like, nope, I am going to get educated in how to be more sustainable and how to create a more sustainable world. And I think so the dread allowed me, it changed my path, like what you were talking about before, it like created a different reality for me. But I also think what I'm seeing, not only in myself, but around me, is a greater sense of purpose and like reflecting on life, which is, I think what you were also touching upon with the mortality, like the contemplating mortality can create a lot of beauty in life in a weird way. Like I know maybe if I wasn't, I would be out partying a lot more in the city and just living in my early 20s as I kind of saw in the movies. But instead I'm like, I have a very different view on what it is to be alive, potentially because I've studied a lot about people who have had their lives taken away from them just by natural disasters and other sad parts of humanity. But I think there is that like kind of beautiful other side of the coin, which is like there is a shift. Like my friends, none of my friends are chasing the biggest salaries right now, and it doesn't matter what field they're in, whether it's sustainability or film, they're chasing feeling okay and work-life balance. And that to me that gives me hope. Like, because I think when we start doing that, we're going to start thinking about other things and be able to grapple with the truth of our existence. So, yeah.
And reading your book, Britt, that was one of the things that really struck me and I really appreciate, is that you covered the mental health aspects, but also the breadth of those side effects, those symptoms, those experiences, those traumas, and really not just being aware of it, but also being like, it's okay, like it's natural, like this actually is a good thing.
Yeah.
That you caring more about yourself and having that kind of belief of, I need to be happy, I don't need to be successful, I need to be okay, I don't need to be rich, like those kinds of ideas tied with the climate. And now you're starting to think through this different lens, and you're thinking about, okay, I need to have a home, I don't want to be hurt by changing weather, I don't want to be hurt by my family getting lost, I want to keep my connections, I want to keep my community, my society, and those things which some people are dealing with, but not necessarily in our privileged world yet. Like for example, in New York, there's like these huge development projects to kind of stem rising sea level, and like a future Sandy a hurricane that flooded the city in 2012. And in the developing world, they don't really have the same kind of perspective. And I think as we get to really face these things into the future, it's really good to have the awareness that this is natural, this is good, but it's also like, it's the first step into action. Like being someone who composts at home is the first step into action outside of your home. Which is another thing that I really appreciate about your book, is like internal helps the external. They aren't like a give, like an ands and an or, like they really benefit each other. They add to each other. So it's really great.
Thank you so much.
What other kinds of reactions are you getting, Britt?
I'm really hearing a lot about people appreciating the beyond black and white, the kind of paradoxical nature of how the horrors and the hopes go together and feed each other in a mutualistic way, which is actually really strengthening and nourishing. A lot just about validation. Honestly, people write me just saying, thank you for giving permission to my feelings. Thank you for not pathologizing them. Thank you for giving me some words with which to think about what I'm going through, because there's still often this disenfranchisement of the feelings, this kind of bubble of silence around them. And it can be hard to find the right settings and right people in our lives to talk about them in a way where people aren't either going to try to minimize it or write it off as being dramatic or, rooted in catastrophic thinking or something, which ends up leaving a person feel kind of abandoned or many times worse. So those kinds of ideas. I am from the mental health community hearing about the emphasis on getting beyond the biomedical model as being something that resonates with many people who are realizing, the narrow one-on-one kind of therapist model that we have is not enough to meet the scope of psychic damage, to meet those who are most in need. It's, often at high cost, needs to be done at bigger scale, but also in more accessible manners. So the kind of social and community interventions pieces there, I think are part of how many people are trying to reconfigure their mental health practice. Yeah, those are some ideas.
That's wonderful. You're also reminding me of the work there, particularly of Susie Moser.
Oh, yeah.
She works in adaptation scale, community scale resilience. And she's been involved with a project she's been pushing for a long time on what she calls the adaptive mind. And let me see if I can share this, because it's these.
Susie's great.
She's been on the show a couple of times. I've known her for 20 years, and she's just, as you say, she's great. But here, what is an adaptive mind? This is Susie Moser, SUSIMOSER. A set of propensities, leadership skills, and capacities that allow an individual embedded in social networks and institutions to respond with agility, creativity, resolve, and resilience to these things: constant change, including surprises, rapid shifts, pervasive uncertainty and not knowing, anticipatory, vicarious, and/or direct traumatic experience and change, and challenges associated with deep systemic and transformative change. And essentially, she's trying to develop techniques, protocols, norms for community scale work with practitioners, particularly. Think about firefighters. Think about the care economy. Everyone in the care economy being so burned out, and now we're having this sort of flight from the people are quitting their jobs, and in places like Maine, no one's working in healthcare now. You can't. see a doctor because there's no one to be at the reception desk.
Wow.
So it feels very resonant with what you were talking about just then, especially that idea of getting beyond the sort of binary doctor-patient approach. I don't know if that feels...
It does. 100%. I think Susie's work is really important. She's been early to the game to recognize this. Focusing on climate adaptation professionals as she does, she really also aligns with what I was chatting about earlier, whereby those who are in this work bear an enormous psychological cost to taking on the difficulty, the information and experiences. And yeah, just like with COVID, or in education, what would happen if all of a sudden all the teachers disappeared? How
Right.
would the generations deal with their own, intellectual fulfillment to deal with a changing world? She asks the same of the compounding hazards of the climate crisis forcing us to contend with. We need to make sure that the people who know the most about this don't check out and move to the countryside to escape the mental exhaustion of their work. And that burnt out people aren't equipped to serve a burning planet, so to speak. But what's interesting now is that
Says she to the guy who just moved to Maine.
Right. But you've still got your Elon Musk satellite and are staying
Exactly.
in the work.
Oh, I'm totally in the work.
Yeah, so I think her work is super crucial, and people need to fund it.
Yeah. So there's a comment here from Philip McMaster. Bold aliveness in conscious land and the conscience verse. Okay. He says, wonderful discussion. Bobby says, wish there were more viewers. Well, share it right now. And of course, afterwards, this will be archived right away. Anyone can share it. Aviva Ramani, who's an artist here in Maine, who works at the interface of climate and catastrophe. And what we do and think about that says optimism and hope are tricky words because it can mean such different things to different people. Now this
so true.
I'm doing a series now called Watchwords of posts and shows. These words that it's not so much everyone has to agree on the meaning of a word, but it's great to have a conversation around the word so everyone who comes to it with a certain vantage point understands that there's dimensionality to words.
Yeah.
So I love that. So the more we can talk about words, the better. But so here we are in the last 10 minutes or so, and I know you have to go to another show right away. So what's your key, goal with the book? I guess, in a perfect world, what might change in a little way as a result of what you're doing? What does the world look like that's marginal? That's kind of I don't like the word marginally, but that's shifting in a way that feels like progress. And then we'll take it back to Devin and Sophia.
Well, thanks for the question. I included memoir aspects in the book about my own struggles with being distressed about what's going on, because I want the book to model the vulnerability that I think is healthy for us to be able to share with each other, and that in order to live well with these feelings, we need to talk about them. And so I hope that it can help with the normalization and stepping out of the disenfranchisement of what's going on a psychological level for people. And I also bring in many other people's stories, not just my own, in order to show some more diverse contours of what this is doing and how what it means for people's approach to harnessing the feelings for pro-social, pro-environmental action, as we all must move on in this situation, which is riddled with horrific injustices. And yet there's so much space for improvement. So that whole process, and as well as getting beyond this kind of 2-inch deep, I would say, tolerance for emotions at all when it comes to science, and to really increase our emotional intelligence and wisdom, and going beyond black and white thinking about the utility of quote unquote positive emotions and quote unquote negative emotions, but understanding that they really work together and they all have important information to teach us and can all be hugely instructive and instrumental and useful. And that we don't have to just immediately react with the shaming idea that there's no space for challenging emotions, because that kind of speaks to our culture of belittlement and emotional immaturity, which is really what I think we're dealing with. So those are some of the goals. And the more politically and structurally, I hope that the book can help encourage the kinds of conversations that will eventually affect policy on what needs to change in our mental health system to protect especially the most vulnerable communities from trauma as the climate crisis rolls on.
Those are powerful goals and wonderfully framed. Aviva Romani added, she agrees that modeling vulnerability is critical because it's our humanity that's fraying at the edges. There's a lot in that comment, especially when you think about politics these days and way beyond the climate challenge. So again, to Sophia and Devin, through this summer and onward, changing that mutually assured destruction to making a difference, moving beyond embracing dread as a normal and real and healthy part of confronting a big threat, but doing something with it. What do you think your lives will look like going forward?
Wow, I think from this discussion and from the book, and from subsequent discussions I will have, I definitely see that making a difference is not necessarily making a difference for the climate, but making a difference for mental health, and seeing like the human toll of what the reality and of that we're going to be living does for us. Because I don't know, when you really look at the movement and the action that's taken place, things follow the top 1% of corporations, of people, of policymakers. It doesn't matter necessarily like what people on the ground are doing. I know someone who's a vegan in the 70s, and veganism is still kind of seen as this abject extremist thing that is now getting a little more popular. And that's because there's vegan brands, there's consumerist products that are vegan, there's more speech about it, Apple's doing it. So I definitely think like acknowledging the consequences that everyday people have and the cognitive effects of that is almost making a bigger difference for everyday people than necessarily saying you should do this, you should do that, you should go on the street and march. Just more so like you should be happy, like you should care about yourself in all the ways that you can, because like Sophia's been saying to me for a while, when people care about themselves, they care about the other people and they care about the planet. And maybe that's like a good way of starting.
Yeah. And
well, go for it.
Sorry. I'll just quickly say, Britt, what you said makes me feel like what I want to do is just do everything I can to make everyone in the world go outside and have like a big collective scream and like be together and cry. And like, it's so much of my belief and work in my very few years of research has been like, let's talk about our feelings. Like it is not it is not like fluffy. It is not, you said this in a your TED talk that I watched, like we need to, it's serious. And I go with Andy, just quickly answer your question going forth. I think what both Devin and I want to do is promote that and potentially organize a giant collective scream where every human can feel the vibrations of each other and their strong emotions in this and feel actually connected, because I think we are extremely disconnected at the moment.
That's an unbelievably powerful final thought here. Britt Wray, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you
us.
so much.
And maybe you can come back sometime when we find time with Sophia and Devin or others. I could bring Sheldon Solomon on again, or we could talk about sort of driving through these tough feelings and realities toward living a full life in the time we have. I do want to close out with a little gift to you all from Reggie Harris, who's a musician who has been on the show many times. And so here's a little music to take us forward. And I think you'll appreciate it if it works.
Hatred all around us, there's fear. Violence touches our lives, and the message is clear. We mourn our martyrs, in our hearts they'll stay. Then we'll sing, we shall overcome, and go on our way. We will not rest till the storm is over. Yeah, we will not lay this burden down. Yeah, we will keep each other strong. strong. We'll love and carry on till we stand all together on solid ground. Till we stand all together on solid ground.
No, yay.
So that
Oh my
was.
gosh.
So again, thank you for being here. These sessions are a lot of fun. I'm going to bring the music back. We haven't done a music session in a long time. And that was conversation
great.
about climate too. That was Genevieve Gunther was in there, who's writing a book on climate language. And Reggie's a great musician focused on the environment and on humanity, on racial harmony. And thanks again for being here. So everybody should definitely check out Generation Dread. It's easy to Google for and find. And I encourage you to read that book and also share this conversation. As soon as we're done, it'll be there on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, everywhere else to push to your friends and to sustain the conversation going forward. This is Andy Revkin at the Columbia Climate School in rural Maine on Penobscot territory. I used to be in the Hudson Valley on Lenape land, and I wish you all well going forward. Come back. Thanks again.
That was really fun. Thank you. Good to be with you all.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank